Hey everybody, welcome back to American Government, POLS 1113. Today we're talking about Chapter 9, Campaigns and Elections, and kind of covering how those are carried out in the United States. Now remember, go through these terms. These are important terms as you go through, and pay close attention to each of those. Now, the first thing that I want to focus on is one of the American values, core American values in the United States, and that's fair and open elections. Now, it's certainly true that elections in the United States have always been kind of gamified, where you're trying to win and beat your opponent. And this is because in the discussion of politics, it's who's getting what and when. It's like if you're playing a game of Monopoly, but it's real life. So people try. So if in the game of Monopoly you are the banker and you have the opportunity to kind of slide an extra 100 your way, $100 bill, and nobody's going to catch you, then the incentive is kind of there sometimes, and that is true in politics as well. And we'll get to that when we talk about redistricting and gerrymandering and things like that later on in this lecture. But the incentive is there for people to kind of behave in a selfish way or kind of bend the rules as much as they can in order to gain a political advantage, because the outcome of that is advantage. And so, in many cases, when you see senators and representatives taking actions, even if they don't seem fair, quote unquote fair, it is fairness doesn't really matter all that much. What matters is power in the political realm, and even though that's kind of a little bit of a cynical approach, it's certainly true. You look back at the Supreme Court nomination fight during the Obama administration, in which Mitch McConnell, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, in the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, would not hear a nomination for Supreme Court justice. And then when the same kind of situation happened during the Trump presidency, the tune was changed. Mitch McConnell changed his tune on that and said that no, we need to seat one as quickly as possible. And so it's one of those things where it's not about fairness in the political game. It's about power and the securing of power. And so if you take that in mind and apply that to elections, you have kind of a different situation come up. Now, Americans uh, have the ideal of fair and open elections, but in all truth, there has always been an attempt to guide elections either through physical action or propaganda manipulation. So, for example, you look at the post-Civil War era, when previously enslaved individuals are now allowed to vote. In many states in the South, during the Jim Crow South, you had things like poll taxes. So basically, you would have to pay a tax in order to vote, or you would have to take a literacy test. You would have to read a portion of the Constitution and then interpret it to the satisfaction of the poll worker. Now, you might ask yourself, well, these don't seem like they're racially biased in that way, but there were situations in place where if you were a white individual who wouldn't be able to pass a literacy test, you might be allowed to vote based on a grandfather clause, which essentially allowed you to vote because your grandfather had voted. And for the people who had been enslaved, obviously their grandparents weren't voting, so they wouldn't be able to have that exemption and would be forced to take those literacy tests. In the modern example, what you often see is the purging of voter rolls, in which legislators will go through, they'll see the voter rolls, and they'll see if there is inactivity in on that information, or they'll try to reach out and locate those individuals, or try to clear out deceased individuals. They will basically purge voter rolls, which essentially means that if you are a member in that purge and you have to go and you're purged from the voter roll, you have to go register to vote again. And so many people might not know that they have been purged from a voter roll until the day of the election, or a couple of days before the election. And then many states don't allow same-day voter registration, so they might miss an election. You also have the removal of voting locations. This was a a major issue during the 2020 election, specifically when it came to mail-in ballots and early ballots, in which you had major cities in Texas that went from several different ballot drop-off locations down to a single drop-off location. I believe that was in Travis County, Texas. And so you, by removing the opportunity for people to deliver their votes, or making it difficult, adding barriers to people voting, that can potentially affect an election. And then you also have propaganda. And this is something that can be as simple as somebody saying, oh, well, the voting day for Democrats is this day and the voting day for Republicans is this day, trying to give one party or the other the correct date and trying to convince some people that, because people will fall for that. And so even if it's kind of in jest, it can have a realistic effect. Now, the important thing to know in the case of the United States is that several court cases, specifically following the 2020 election, but over the past several elections, election security in the United States has gotten better. It's gotten more efficient. And one of the main reasons why election security is pretty good in the United States is that all of this is kind of done in the public, in public view. There are nonpartisan and partisan officials who are able to be in the room as votes are counted and watch those tabulations. There are systems in place where if there is a discrepancy, then that can be basically taken to a court, and the court system can discuss that. But by and large, in the United States, we have very low instances of intentional manipulation or voter fraud. There are often cases of accidental or inadvertent voter fraud, but those cases are very, very rare and often are never at the level of coordination that would sway a vote one way or another. And in the same way, the ways that a manipulation could occur is basically available to all parties. Essentially, that if there is one tactic of manipulation that might work, it could also work for another. And since both parties are trying to vie for as much authority as they can, they almost essentially cancel each other out. Because if that was to take place, it would take place equally on either side of that two-party system. Now, in the United States, there are some systems in place that kind of reinforce the two-party system, particularly when it comes to party column ballots. Now, many people will, when they go to the ballot box, might see something like this. And this is an office block ballot. This is a little bit more even keel and not really designed to influence a person. You'll have candidates listed in a random order, or they might be listed in alphabetical order, but they'll have their name and then they'll have their party below them, and then it's all within the office. Party column ballots are different in that you can see the individuals from a particular party within an office, or you can select a straight party ticket in which you would vote for all the members who are running under this umbrella. Now, obviously, this benefits the party system because at the top level, people might be familiar with some of the higher ballot or upper ballot issues, but lower down, these judges and city council people and things like that, they might not have familiarity with them. And by running these straight line party tickets, it allows for those parties to kind of reinforce their authority. Whereas on these office block ballots, people might end up in a situation where maybe they don't know as much about specific candidates, but they're not, the only indication of their party is underneath their name. Now, in the United States, a general election or a general presidential election occurs every 4 years, but midterm elections take place in the 2 years in between. So every 2 years, there's an election. It's generally considered a midterm if there's not a president on the ticket. And it's a general presidential election every 4 years. So when a single term of the presidency has expired. And general elections are basically just these, massive elections often in November that are regularly scheduled, and they involve all or most of the nation. So you'll have a general election is a midterm election, a general election is a general presidential election, but a midterm election is a specific type, and a general presidential election is a specific type of general election. And the reason I break this down is because there might be instances where you go and vote in August for your city council, but that's not a general election. That might be local, or it even might be state-based. And each election season begins with a primary. A primary is basically a process by which the individual parties will select their candidate for who they want to nominate for whatever position they have them in, whether that's presidency or Senate or whatever. And primaries kind of have a couple of different forms that can take place. You can have a closed primary where party members only who have been previously enrolled are allowed to vote, or they can be open where voters can register the day of. Now, there are benefits to each, and there are drawbacks to each. A closed primary ensures that only members of your party or long-standing members of your party will be able to vote. So you don't have members of an opposing party coming in and trying to influence that primary election. And the downside of that, though, is that you often have the more extreme candidates rather than the candidates who are best fit for the office winning those primaries. And I say that because if you take a general U.S. population and say you're focusing on the binary system of left and right, and you take an individual that is palatable or somewhat palatable to all, then that person is going to be kind of in the middle. But if you break that in half and then go from extreme right to right center, then the middle is going to shift, and it's going to be more to extreme right than might be palatable to the general public. The same way with the left, it might be more extreme left than center left. And what that does is that kind of serves to kind of divide this party system and really reward extremism in political viewpoints. And what you'll see after the primary is generally a person who has won the nomination for that primary will kind of come back to center, is what it's often called, where they'll try to pivot a little bit out of the political primary or the party primary system and then go back into kind of a more moderate tone. Now, an open primary is one where voters can register for the party on the day of. This can be beneficial because it can allow independent voters who are undecided to have a say in who the party's nominee is, and it allows to kind of bring people into the party in a new way. The downside is you can have individuals who are registered with the alternative party to come register the day of and try to influence the outcome of that, either by voting for the most extreme candidate who would not be palatable to the general public, or by voting for a more moderate candidate who would be palatable to the general public. Now, this nomination process is really how parties select their candidates for office. The actual election portion is carried out by the individual states. The nomination process is carried out by the parties within the state. So each party kind of carries out its own nomination in whatever way it sees fit. You could have a primary election in which you schedule it and people go to the polls and they go and they vote just like a regular election. But you can also have caucuses. Caucuses are basically a system where everybody in a specific voting area gathers together and they divide themselves to different parts of a room, showing or demonstrating, going on record for their candidate of preference. Now, with the caucus system, it's not a private ballot. You have to go on record and publicly support an individual. And then if a person has the lowest number of votes, then they will be eliminated from the pool, and all of the voters in their corner will have to spread out and go to another candidate. So what you often see is that caucus system being more kind of a spectacle and focused. And so, for example, you have the Iowa caucuses, which are the first in the nation caucuses when we prepare for a presidential election system. In how we vote for candidates, there's a bunch of different ways that you can do it. Now, there are different ways, like I said, to run the election. There's a majority system in which the winner of an election is the candidate who wins a majority of votes. This idea of majority rule is pretty common in the way that we vote for things. We vote if you're doing a classroom vote. Usually you'll go by majority rule. If you have half or more, then you have a majority rule. A lot of decision making in the House of Representatives and the Senate is majority rule, in which if you have 50%, 50% plus one, then you have a majority. But there could be an instance here in which you have 3 or 4 candidates where no individual receives a majority. In that case, you have to do a runoff, in which either you can do an instant runoff where people will vote on a ballot based on ranked choice, which is kind of a complex voting system, but it allows for an instant runoff, or you have to pick the top 2 performing individuals and then host another election. Basically, in 1 month we're going to come back and we're going to do a runoff. Now, obviously, this can be very burdensome to people, and it can depress voter turnout in that way. But many countries, including the United States, use the plurality system, in which the winning candidate is the one who receives the most votes, not necessarily the majority of votes. And so, in the office of the presidency, you can win a minority of the votes, but or even just a plurality of the votes, but still secure enough electoral votes in order to win the presidential election. Now, many states will use this winner-take-all system even if a candidate doesn't win the majority. So say you've got 3 candidates, specifically when it comes to the Electoral College, which we'll talk about in a little bit. When it comes to the Electoral College, if a candidate wins 40% of the vote in Oklahoma, but the other candidates won 30% and 30% of the vote, then you will see Oklahoma award all of its electoral votes to the individual who won the plurality of votes. And so this winner-take-all system really allows for a candidate to win even if they did not receive a majority of votes. Now, in some countries, what they'll do is they'll have proportional representation rather than this winner-take-all plurality. And proportional representation is a system in which, when it comes to like a parliament or something like that, if your party wins 30% of the votes, you get 30% of the seats. So you can see that this really benefits smaller parties. Now, this is kind of difficult to read, but this is the breakdown of the British Parliament. And you have, for instance, in blue here, the Conservative Party. By far, it's the largest party, but the smaller parties have kind of grouped together and banded together in order to constitute a working majority. So even these small groups, even if you have the Scottish National Party in this example move over to partner with the Conservative Party, that could have the ability to influence who is in control. Specifically, we have the Liberal Democrats. Obviously, the Liberal Democrats wouldn't, in the British Parliament, wouldn't side with the Conservative Party. But if they did, that move of that block of voters over to this side would shift the majority. So what happens is, in this proportional representation system, you have small parties that have the ability to have a major influence on the structure of government because it's all proportional. And this works. This is much more common in parliaments, and it's much more common in places that have several small parties with a significant voting authority. Now, voting and the process of voting is split into districts in the same way that state governments are split into county governments, are split into local governments. So what you'll often have is these voting districts that are designated by the state. So you might have a focus on everybody on the eastern side of the state is voting for Representative Seat 1. everybody in this portion of the state is voting for representative seat 2. And this happens following a census. So you have a census, and then states have a population shift, and then some states are required to redraw their maps based on population changes, or they might have an increase or decrease in the number of representatives that are in that system. This is known as the process of redistricting. Now, even though states can run their elections as we've discussed they have, Baker versus Carr from 1962 ruled that the federal courts can intervene in certain extreme situations, and we'll talk about how that applies racially in just a minute. But you have this situation in which, in the process of redistricting, you can many political parties will engage, or both political parties will engage in what's called gerrymandering, in which they will draw a new district in a way that tries to either give unfair advantage to one political group or water down political influence of an opposing political group. This is actually happening in Kansas right now during the process of redistricting, in which the Republican-led Congress is, or the Republican-led legislature is redrawing these districts, and they are redrawing the new districts in a way that will water down the political influence of Manhattan, Kansas, or sorry, Lawrence, Kansas, which is traditionally considered to be kind of a Democratic stronghold. Now, courts have ruled that political gerrymandering is perfectly allowed. You can do that and make those changes based on political methods to try to ensure your power in that way. This kind of goes back to what I said before, where it's not about fairness in this situation. It's not about ensuring that everything is fair in the political spectrum. It is about the acquisition of power. So if you looked at this item here, you have, let me pull up a laser pointer here. You look at this map right here, and you can see, as it's broken down, 60% of these 50 precincts are blue and 40% are red. Now you need to break them into into groups. Now, if you were breaking them into groups fairly, you would put 3 blue districts and 2 red districts. Because that would be accurate to the representative of the proportion of the population as it is. But if you were to draw the lines in this square, you can see you can water down the red influence in each of these districts, and so all five elections would go to blue. However, you could also draw the districts in a way that waters down blue districts and breaks them apart into superpower blue districts. So the blue districts would only win 2 of these elections because they're all packed into the same place. But red would win in these 3 because of the way that the lines were drawn. They're basically sacrificing this district and this district, but they have political authority in these districts. So through that process, you have this system where you can pack political groups and political influence and kind of try to water down that political influence. Now, partisan gerrymandering, like I said, occurs when a party draws the lines that give them a greater chance of winning an election. Now, what we've seen in the past, the historical past in the United States, is this try to be applied both positively and negatively to racial groups. Now, Shaw versus Reno in 1993, the Supreme Court prevented the creation of what were called majority-minority districts. And the way they did this is by trying to, you could either, in the drawing of these districts, you had 30% minority packing, which is basically taking these minority groups in blue and packing them into these small districts. And so there are 2 where they have significant influence, 2 where blue can elect a candidate of their choice, and 1 where they have no influence, or a 50% minority packing, where 2 can elect the candidate of their choice and 3 have no political influence. And what this is called is packing and cracking. So basically, if you pack all the voters of a certain, in using racial geography, pack all the voters of a certain race into a district, then that allows that group to have representation, but in oftentimes an unfair way. And the same thing with cracking. If you draw districts in a way that splits communities apart to try to reduce the influence of individuals based on race, cracking is a tactic that has been deemed as unconstitutional as well. Now, the steps of the actual elections, the presidential elections in the United States. You have the primaries, which we talked about, the National Convention. The convention is basically where the nominee is selected, and then the general election itself. Now, the Electoral College serves as the official elector of the President of the United States. The popular vote does not indicate the presidential, who will win the presidency. And this is obviously has been cause for some controversy because in 2 times in the past 20 years, you've had an instance where an individual has lost the popular vote but has won the electoral vote. In the election of 2000 between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and the election of 2016 between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And so when it comes down to the Electoral College, there is a broad discussion about the merits of that system, in which you have a majority of U.S. citizens selecting or showing preference for one candidate, but the individual who won the minority of the popular vote winning. And there are a lot of reasons for that. So states receive delegates based on their number of representatives and senators. And so you have 538 electoral votes. And a candidate must earn 270 to win the presidency. Now, that's kind of covered in here, but I want to go back to that map real quick. Now, in discussion of the pros and cons of the Electoral College, a lot of people will say, well, if it doesn't demonstrate the actual preference of the American people, then it needs to be gotten rid of. It needs to be eliminated. And that is a fair argument. On the other side of that, you see a lot of the population centers in the United States are in places like Texas, Florida, East Coast and New York, Pennsylvania, West Coast, California, and even in the Northeast here. All of these numbers are based on population, but the Electoral College ensures that places like Montana and Wyoming and North and South Dakota, and even places like Oklahoma and Kansas and Arkansas have a say in the election of the President of the United States. Now, the way that the Electoral College operates, most states will give all of their electoral votes to the candidate who has won the majority, not a proportion. And this is done because states want to increase their influence. Again, going back to fairness, in a perfectly fair system, the states, if you had 40 votes in Texas and one candidate won 20% or 40% of the vote and one candidate won 60% of the vote, then you would see that broken down 40-60. So you would break it down 30 votes, or basically 30 electoral votes for one, 10 electoral votes for the other, ish. And so in this system, states try to consolidate their own political influence in that way. And that can lead to the situation in which a person who has won a minority of the popular vote can win the majority, or win the majority of the electoral votes. And another way, another kind of defense of the Electoral College, the Electoral College allows for elections to be decided within a few weeks of the conclusion of the election. If every single vote that was cast was up for debate and argument, it could be incredibly difficult to really ever come up with who had won the election. Especially you look at the 2020 election with all of the confusion that was thrown up from allegations of voter fraud and court cases and challenging votes and things like that, even with President Trump refusing to concede, and the raid on the U.S. Capitol, essentially the insurgency in the U.S. Capitol. You had a situation in which the 2020 election was very fraught, and even with the Electoral College. So you imagine not having that system of certainty, or measured certainty, and then you can imagine very quickly how elections would be even more contentious than they already are. Now, when running for the presidency, an individual has to carry out a presidential campaign, and that's just an effort by that candidate to win support for their bid for office. And so you either have incumbents or challengers in that. So an incumbent is a person who's already in the office. So in 2024, if Joe Biden decides to run again for election, he will be the incumbent. Incumbents are people who generally hold an advantage in office. Now, that's not always true in the case of the presidency. It's more played out or more evident in senators, representatives, lower level state officials. Incumbency generally will grant somebody a benefit, and then a challenger is a person who is trying to remove that person from office and then replace them. Every 2 terms, if a president wins 2 terms, then you have a vacant office. So in 2016, following 2 consecutive terms by Barack Obama, you had vacancy in the president, so you had 2 challengers in that office. And so you didn't have one didn't have the benefit of the incumbency. Campaigns are pretty large-scale operations. They are coordinated by a variety of individuals on a special team. This includes consultants, pollsters, people who are conducting polls, press spokespeople who are basically taking all the information or taking all the things that the candidate has said and trying to package it up in a way that will play well with the press. And you will usually have a campaign manager. In this image, you have Jen O'Malley Dillon, who was the campaign manager for the 2020 Biden campaign. And modern campaigns are essentially short-term businesses. They are businesses that have been created for the express purpose of getting somebody elected to office, but they have the same systems in place that most businesses do. They have individuals who are on staff. They have individuals who are volunteer. They have payroll and health insurance and all that kind of stuff. And modern campaigns are really fueled by donations and fundraising. One of the major focuses of a campaign is completing fundraising, carrying out those activities, and ensuring that the candidate has enough money to finish out their run for election. You also, in the more modern context, have the occasional presidential debate. There were 3 in the last presidential run. Usually they are a debate, a town hall meeting in which individuals can kind of discuss things with voters, and then a 3rd debate. Public debates require a candidate to present what is generally a mix of prepared and on-the-spot remarks. So some prepared, some on the spot, that sort of thing. And what we've seen in the historical past, so really pre-2016, was that televised debates could have a major influence over decision making. But really in 2016, and particularly in 2020, fewer people found value in watching the debate, specifically because of what was the disastrous first debate, in which the candidates were barely coherent when not necessarily discussing policy in a broad way, but trying to get in personal attacks and interrupting and shouting over each other and that sort of thing. The first televised debate was Nixon versus Kennedy in 1960, and one of the main reasons that John Kennedy was able to win the presidency that year is because he presented very well on television. Nixon was just getting over a cold. He was kind of pale and sweaty and sniffling, and John Kennedy was able to kind of present himself as a young, articulate, policy-minded individual, and that impressed a lot of people. Now, when it comes to how people engage with this system, we'll use demographics a lot when it comes to how we track voter participation. So age plays a major role. The 65 plus group has the highest voter turnout. We've discussed that a little bit previously, but these individuals are often retired and they're able to engage in civic organizations and community service a lot more. And so they have the ability to do this unpaid work, oftentimes going door to door, hosting meetups or things like that. The group from 18 to 29 has the lower turnout, and that's largely because these are the people who are in school, or raising their families, or starting their careers. They are doing the regular life events that oftentimes doesn't allow them a lot of time for volunteerism and doesn't allow them a lot of time for political engagement. And so, what political campaigns will do is they'll try to target reliable voting blocks. This is why you see candidates generally try to make friends among the 65 plus group, is because they know that they're going to turn out. And in the absence of a reliable voter block, you have to reach out and try to explore a new voter block. Now, what we see in the modern context is younger voters tend to connect with more personable candidates. This was certainly true during the Obama presidency, or the Obama campaign, the first Obama campaign that was largely driven by Facebook. And then you have individuals, younger, personable, charismatic individuals are more likely to persuade younger candidates or younger voters, because you kind of look at who you engage with. So your celebrities are not the same as the celebrities of your parents. So you look at, you probably still know of, Tom Cruise and Dwayne Johnson and all those individuals, but the people who you are engaging with might be Twitch streamers, they might be YouTubers, they might be Instagram people, they might be TikTok individuals, and so they are in many ways engaging with their audience in a much more direct way, and so you're not going to get Tom Cruise to look out in the middle of a movie and say, "Hey, thanks for your support, Jason. I really like you," or whatever. But if you're donating to somebody's Patreon, and they might give you a shout out in one of their streams, or if you tip them on YouTube, or tip them on Twitch or something like that. And so you'll generally see younger people, the celebrities of younger people are generally more accessible than the celebrities of yesteryear. You also have race and ethnicity play a major role when it comes to participation. And I've kind of talked about this before, but descriptive representation is a process by which when an individual sees someone like them, whether it is a woman seeing a woman, a black person seeing a black person, a Latino seeing a Latino in a position of authority, that it leads to increased political participation, because they see someone like them in that office, which means that it is achievable. And so descriptive representation can play a major role. What you also see in terms of race is that African Americans will generally vote pretty reliably, and they will vote in a way that is very uniform, largely similar. Now, certainly there are separations. There are thousands of African Americans who are Republicans, but what you'll often see is the African American population, in large part, in vast majority, generally aligning themselves and voting with Democratic candidates. Not always, but in large part. Participation from the Latinx community can be really mixed. This is because you have a population that is incredibly diverse. Yes, 60% have Mexican ancestry, but the other 40% are coming from Central and South America. They're coming from the Caribbean. And so you have kind of this mix in the community values. You have individuals who might be highly religious, so they might be very socially conservative, but they are maybe they have grown up with larger family relationships, and maybe they align themselves more with socially liberal programs, or governmentally liberal programs. So social support programs, social service networks, things like that. But when it comes to person's actions or social actions, they might be more socially conservative in that way. Asian communities are highly diverse, as we've discussed as well. Uh, Asian can include Indian and Chinese and Japanese and Filipino and Malaysian. And so there's not really a whole lot of uniformity there. But what you will often see is Asian communities will kind of gather together as a voting bloc in local elections and have significant voice in local elections, largely because they are smaller minority communities. But when they are grouped, when they are living in ethnic communities, they are largely grouped and can have significant authority. Socioeconomic status can play a role as well. So socioeconomic status is basically an individual's status in society based on their level of education, income, and occupational prestige. So what we see is occupational prestige is something like you might be a truck driver making $100,000 a year, but you might not have the same level of occupational prestige in your own mind as a mid-level manager making $60,000 a year. Just because the mid-level manager has responsibilities as it regards personnel and scheduling, and they might have the opportunity for different bonuses and things like that. So even though an individual driving a truck might be making more money, they might not have the same amount of occupational prestige as somebody who is a manager. And sometimes that is kind of how a person views themselves or their own occupation. The question of whether or not you're hesitant to tell people what you do for a living. Obviously, you're going to have people who are proud of their occupation regardless. But when it comes to your socioeconomic status, that can play a major role. Increased income and higher education generally results in higher voting habits. So between the people of ages 45 to 64, of earners of over $150,000, 83% of those people vote. So 83% of the people who earn over $150,000 in their household will vote. And 43% of the people who are earning less than $20,000 will vote. So basically a very low number of people will vote. The voting decreases the amount that your taxes go down, essentially, is why that's the case. If you are making $150,000 or more, you're falling into these higher level tax brackets, and people will generally get more politically active when their taxes are at stake. And then 52% of people with a high school diploma will vote, but 74% of people with a college degree will vote. So basically, higher political knowledge, higher education level, and an understanding of what can be at stake can increase your participation in the political system. Now, when people make their decision on who they're going to vote for, they'll use either prospective voting, in which they kind of have this based on this imagined future. During the 2008 Obama presidential campaign, one of the major focuses was his tagline of hope, and this was a clear example of prospective voting, in which people are reaching out and saying, oh, well, I want to have this type of future, so I'm going to vote for this candidate. Retrospective voting is voting based on the performance of a candidate or party. And you saw this in large part with the turnout in the 2020 election. There were a electoral majority and a majority of U.S. voters that were unhappy with the Trump presidency, and went on to vote for Joe Biden. Now, this wasn't necessarily from a specifically prospective instance, but there's always a mix of the two, right? So there's always a little bit of prospective voting for a future that you want to have, and a retrospective voting based on the records of the person who has the performance of the candidate or the party. Now, a lot of people won't vote, and they won't vote for a lot of different reasons. Some of those might be low political efficacy, a low belief that they have any ability to influence government, or voting fatigue. If they're voting, like they feel like they're voting all the time, or every time they go to the voting booth, that there's 150 people that they're voting for and they're just sick of it, or the cost benefit analysis of it. The way that we have voting set up in the United States, most often it's on a Tuesday, and yes, it runs generally from 7 to 7, but when an individual is at work and then they got to pick their kids up from school and then they've got to make dinner and then they've got to go to basketball practice they got to take their kid to basketball practice, then it might not be worth it for them to go. They might think that it's not worth it for them to go and take time out of their day to go vote because they've got all of these other things that they want to do, specifically when it's not necessarily an office that they quote unquote care about. And then when it comes to that fundraising portion, like we mentioned, you have a bunch of different ways that campaigns can raise money. They'll raise money through individual voters, political action committees, super political action committees. All of these are broken down in your book in terms of how much each is allowed to give to a candidate. But what we often see in recent years is the rise of dark money, which are groups that can spend an unlimited amount of money and keep donors private as long as they're not coordinated with candidates and the political activity is not their primary purpose. So if they have some sort of other activity and then there's a political arm of that where they're pumping a lot of that money through, if they can show that that's not their primary purpose, they can essentially spend whatever money they want as long as they're not coordinating with the candidate themselves. So as we go through, continue focusing on that. We're going to be breaking down some of these other different media and technology systems as we go on forward, but continue reading through the chapters, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Bye.